There we go. Okay, we are now recording. Let's see. We have archived client enrichment series videos on our YouTube channel. You can access all 32 past sessions at any time, day or night. And there's a link to our YouTube channel at the end of today's slide deck. Today's presenters are three of our talented colleagues from the Office of GSA's Chief Financial Officers team: Jimbo Strachan, Michael Bonacore, and Shantoria Fontenot. Opening up today's session is Jimbo Strachan. Jimbo is the Director of the Public Building Service and Analytics Division in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. Jimbo manages revenue operations and analytics in support of the Public Building Service. Prior to his role as Director, he served as the Rent Estimate Team Lead in various positions across GSA, including the PBS Strategic Analysis Division, and as a PBS Policy Advisor for the Office of Congressional Affairs. Jimbo has a bachelor's degree in finance from Virginia Tech, and he currently resides in Northeast DC with his wife and 2 children. Following Jimbo's introductory comments, we'll hear from Michael Bonacore. Michael is the National Rent Estimate Lead for the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, PBS Analytics Division, based in Washington, DC. Michael is responsible for overseeing the formulation, justification, and distribution of the annual rent estimate. The program manages over 20,000 occupancy agreements, totaling just over $10 billion in annual revenue. Michael began his GSA career in the GSA headquarters in a 2-year rotational program before transitioning to the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. Michael holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from the James Madison University and a master's degree in business administration from George Mason University. Our other presenter is Shantoria Fontenot. She's a contract financial management analyst in the OCFO PBS Analytics Division, also based in Washington, DC. Shantoria works on the formulation of the yearly rent estimate and has been a contractor with GSA for 7 years. Shantoria began in the Internal Controls Division and 3 years ago was transferred to the PBS Analytics Division to work on the rent estimate. She holds a bachelor's degree in financial economics at the State University of New York, Binghamton, and a master's degree in business administration from the University of Maryland, College Park. Go Terrapins! Today, we are learning about what goes into my agency's rent estimate. The rent estimate provides you, our customers, a basis to develop a space budget request. And it's a pretty data-intensive process. Whether you are a very experienced rent estimate user or this is totally new ground for you, you'll find value in the next 90 minutes. Before I turn the presentation over to Jimbo to say a few words, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. As you can see from our registration process and our classroom today, that we have moved to Zoom for Government for a virtual platform for this session. If you've never participated in a Zoom webinar before, let me just share a few ideas on optimizing your session experience. At the top center of your screen, if you move your cursor over, you should see View Options. If you click on that, you'll see 3 options. First is Zoom Ratio. This is where you can zoom in or out, making the presentation the size you would like. The second option is Exit Full Screen. This is just like other exit full screens you may have used in other applications. You can toggle back and forth, again, to help with seeing the presentation. The third option is Side by Side, and this is probably already checked. If you turn this off, the video of the presenters will disappear from your screen and you'll just see the presentation. All of these options are within your control. You can also use your individual controls to open our chat pod. They're at the bottom of your screen, which is where we will post helpful tidbits and where we welcome your comments and questions. The chat will appear on the lower part of your screen on the right side of your, will appear on the lower part of your screen or the right side, depending on the view option you have selected. As we begin, you should also be able to see our CES session presenters. Aren't they a good-looking bunch? There we go. A CES first. If at any time you'd like to maximize the slide viewing area of your screen, you can use the photo corners image. Those are like the little corners in the photos if you have any of the old photos in your family with the little corners in the upper right hand corner of your screen to toggle to full screen or exit full screen. Those are your options to maximize the slide size. You can toggle back and forth by selecting exit full screen mode to bring back the chat pane and the video of the presenters. Once again, please be aware that we are recording today's session and that we post archived client enrichment series on our YouTube channel. The link to which, as I mentioned, is at the end of your slide deck, and it will pop up in the chat box as well. Speaking of that slide deck, all registered attendees should have received a PDF copy of today's slides via email yesterday. However, please let us know if you did not receive it. The deck comes from the mailbox called, one big long word, Client Enrichment Series at gsa.gov. We have automatically muted your microphones to preserve the audio quality of today's presentation. And though we have muted all attendees today, we do encourage you to use that chat feature. Uh-oh, someone's got no sound. Okay, we'll try to help you with that, Deborah. To please use that chat feature to ask questions of our presenters and our subject matter experts. We will monitor the chat throughout the presentation and respond to your questions in the chat or as part of the presentation. And any questions that we are unable to get to today will be noted, and all of the questions will be answered and posted on our www.gsa.gov/CES website. Housekeeping done. As I mentioned, Jimbo would like to say a few words. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca. I just wanted to take a quick moment, provide a little additional background context before we jump in. As you heard, our team, Mike Chantori and I, are with GSA's Office of the Chief Financial Officer. However, we fully support the Public Building Service and solely the Public Building Service, no other parts of GSA. So we work very closely with our PBS counterparts in every aspect of our work. And I mention that to assure you that we are competent when speaking about PBS rent processes, but also to make you aware that there may be some questions you have that will need to defer to our PBS counterparts. There are just so many pieces of the space acquisition and management processes that PBS does that have a downstream financial impact, and sadly, we cannot be experts in every aspect. Please ask your questions regardless in the chat. We will answer what we can and follow up where needed. So what do? We manage revenue operations for PBS. Most prominently, this is rent bill execution, process of extracting occupancy data each month, appending the appropriate financial elements like treasury account symbols and lines of accounting, which we will not be getting into today, and ensuring that billing data is successfully routed through our accounting system and on to treasury. We also manage the Rent on the Web application. Hopefully many of you are familiar with that, and that we will touch on briefly today. So bookending that rent execution piece, our office also leads forecasting and analysis for PBS operations, which brings us to our topic for today, the rent estimate. I think we'd like to bring up a polling question to get started, looking to set a baseline for our attendees today. There we are. So the question is, what is your familiarity with your agency's rent estimate? And we'll give you all a moment to check in. All right, so it looks like we're all across the board, which is good. And I think our presentation is mostly focused on a rent estimate 101 high level. We'll get into a few details, and of course we're here for some more specific questions. So I think we'll kind of cover everyone across the board here. So with that said, I think I'm gonna pass it off on to Mike to get started with our agenda and get into the meat of this. Mike.
Great, thank you, Jimbo, and thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. So let's get into our agenda for what we're gonna go over today. So the first item that we'd like to address is just giving you a high-level overview of the rent program here at GSA. After we're finished with that, we're going to get into some rent billing basics, followed by what basically the crux of the whole presentation is, rent estimate 101. What goes into your rent estimate? How do we formulate it? Timelines, and then as Jimbo had discussed, we'll move towards questions and things like that. We've got a section that's devoted to frequently asked questions. So on an annual basis, there's a lot of questions that we get from customers like you that are frequently asked. So we want to highlight those and present those to you so that maybe if you haven't asked the question or haven't seen it, it's probably useful for you to see some questions that we get a lot from customers. And then lastly, we'd like to address, we'd just like to have a Q&A session. So like Jimbo had mentioned, throughout this presentation, feel free to enter your questions within that chat window. And then once we get to this section, we'll address those questions. Any questions that we can't address, we'll be sure to follow up with you on that. And then we'll leave the session with just some resources that you can take with you as we go forward. So with that, let's get right into the rent program at a glance. So GSA provides space and services to over 100 federal agencies. So there's a statute out there that basically requires us to charge commercially equivalent rent. So based on that premise and based on the law, we build, PBS has built pricing policy around that tenant, and we have developed a rent estimate program that's around that as well. So a lot of times we'll have conversations about market rates and appraisals and new lease rates. It's all based on the premise of that commercially equivalent rent. So some highlights that we want to go over to just give you sort of that 40,000 foot view is first, GSA manages over 1,400 federal buildings and over 7,000 leased buildings nationwide. As you can see, a lot of the federal buildings are major ones that you might already know of, such as the White House complex or maybe even the Jacob Javits Center in New York City. And then leases, we manage tons of leases. Those, I think, a great example of those would be the Social Security Administration has those small offices throughout the country that help folks with Social Security checks and answering questions on Social Security. A lot of those spaces are leased through GSA, so we help manage those. The GSA rent program manages a total of 348 million square feet for all of our customer agencies nationwide. We manage on any given month around 20,000 occupancy agreements, and that totals around just over $10 billion in rent on an annual basis. And that money goes back into reinvesting in our federal owned space as well as into the leased program that we run. So getting into some rent billing basics. So when federal agencies come to GSA to find housing, the two parties enter into an occupancy agreement that lays out the terms. This includes the square footage to be occupied. It includes the rates that will be charged to these agreements. A lot of the different components that go into the rent bill include things like shell rent, operating cost, tenant improvement, real estate taxes, and parking. I think one interesting thing to note here about, let's just take tenant improvement, for example. Oftentimes folks will ask for various things to be done in their space, such as maybe even painting walls, things like that before they take occupancy. And things like that will end up being added onto the rent bill as a tenant improvement. So once the rent billing process commences, there's a bill that's processed, and you can access your rent bills through our online system called Rent on the Web. There you'll be able to access current as well as past bills, and you can review what your billing information is through that application. Next, we want to just go over a sample rent bill. So this is the March 2020 rent bill for one of the occupancies that we have within GSA. This is an occupancy in the Philadelphia region. So a couple things to note here. At the top, the rates that I had discussed earlier, like shell rent, these are going to show up in the top section. So you'll see shell rent if there's operating cost that's associated with the occupancy agreement. These things will be at the top. You'll notice under the charge basis, So this particular occupancy agreement occupies 27,000 square feet of space at a rate of $9.88. So the rent bill will list out the monthly amount, and it'll also list out the year-to-date amount that's as of the fiscal year. So since this is March 2020, the year-to-date amount is showing you how much rent for the fiscal year has been charged through March 2020. Moving down, we have other things like agency-specific rent components. Are there things, for example, building-specific amortized capital that's related to security charges that are associated with the occupancy agreement? Are there parking spaces that are associated with your occupancy agreement? Those things are going to be applied into this section of the rent bill. And then lastly, we want to point out any sort of adjustments that are going to be hitting your rent bill. You'll see them in this section down here. This can include things like adjustments to correct for a prior month's error, free rent or broker commission credits that are being applied to leased space, or any sort of additional adjustments that might hit the rent bill would show up down here. And then as you go forward, you'll see what the total amounts are for the total rent, your total antenna, and any additional charges that hit this rent bill will show up as well. So next we're going to get into sort of the crux of our presentation, and we're going to talk to you about how it is that we calculate the rent estimate. So first off, we just want to provide, well, what is the rent estimate? So the rent estimate is providing you with a baseline to develop your space budget request that your agency submits to OMB. There are, and the first part of the rent estimate is the base rent estimate. And this component calculates the future cost of your currently billing space. So it'll calculate what the future cost of the occupancy agreements that bill in a particular month are going to be. The next component of the rent estimate factors in anticipated space changes. So obviously everything that bills in a particular month, we know that when we look into the future, all of those OAs are not going to continue billing. You may vacate certain spaces, you may increase or decrease your occupancy in those spaces, and this component will factor that in. So how we do this is we take, we basically use the PBS pricing policy, and we establish a set of business rules that are used to look at the occupancy agreements and figure out what the future rates in those spaces are going to be. So this is supposed to mirror PBS pricing policy for escalating existing rates. Our system, or our formulation process uses multiple data sources to capture those free rents. This includes, for lease projects, it includes what future leases may be coming from the private sector. And it also includes on owned draft occupancy agreements, it includes what the changes in space will be for those spaces. So we wanted to break this out into two components.
Michael, I'm sorry. Did you want to do the poll question?
Yeah.
It's all right.
Apologize. Yeah, so before I move on into the specific components, we have another poll question. And this one kind of will get a lay of the land and for you all about who actually gets the rent estimate and who doesn't. So Rebecca, can you throw that question up?
Sure thing. And let me just read the question for the folks who, I'm sorry, cannot see the poll. The question just says, or it's a statement, I receive a copy of the annual rent estimate from GSA, and then your choices for answer are yes and no. And it looks like we've got about 65% no and 35% yes. Give it just another minute, then we'll share our results. Got to tell you, nice voter turnout on this. We got 53% people voting. All right, here we go. We'll share the results. And the final results, again, for those who can't see this, we had yes, that they received the annual rent estimate at 43% and no at 57%.
Okay, great. So I think that that's very helpful for us to know in terms of looking at the process that we use to send the rent estimate out. So we appreciate that. We appreciate the folks who participated in that poll, and that's really going to help us to look at our existing process and how we distribute the estimate and probably also work more with the customer engagement team to make sure that more folks are actually getting the distribution, because definitely that's an issue that comes up is that folks throughout the nation are kind of asking, where's my estimate? And when we look into it, we find that either their name is not on the distribution list, or there was some other hiccup. So thank you for participating in that poll. So moving on, what we want to talk about is we want to break up the base rent estimate with the space change component. So we'll start with the first component of our rent estimate. So the base rent estimate is the first of two components. The base rent estimate is the foundation that we provide to you of your rent estimate. So what it is we use a particular billing month to grab all of the OAs that billed and create an estimate that runs through the budget year for all of those OAs. Typically, the past several years, we've used March as that foundation. So all of the occupancy agreements that bill in March are used as the base. The base rent estimate does a couple of things. The formulation does the following. First, it assumes continued occupancy through the entire budget period. So in other words, every OA, every occupancy agreement that bills in March, we assume that that occupancy will continue billing through September 2022. And what that process does is it allows us to establish what rates are going to be running through the entire budget period. If any rates expire within that period, we go out and we are able to grab replacement rates for the occupancy agreement. On the federally owned side, any sort of rates that are expiring within our window, we grab new appraised rates and we apply them in the month at which they are effective. For leased space, if there's any rates that are expiring within our window, we have a system that goes out and captures what the estimated lease rate is for that particular project. Excuse me. And lastly, where available, we are able to capture any sort of anticipated credits that are going to be associated with your occupancy agreement, such as free rent or broker commission credits. We also capture estimated taxes that are going to be on top of what is in the base tax year. Oops. So what we wanted to do was, and we thought this would be helpful, was to go back to an example of a rent bill and to show you how our system is actually grabbing the information from the rent bill and how it's finding what those future appraised rates are and what the different changes are going to be. So what you're looking at here right now is a March 2020 rent bill for just a particular occupancy agreement within GSA in the Atlanta, Georgia area. So this OA billed March 2020. So our system grabbed this. It grabbed the 5,153 square feet that billed. It grabbed the rates that are associated. And in the back end in our application, our system went out and found that that $11 rate per square foot was being applied through 11 months of the budget year, which is fiscal 2022. Our system also found that that $11 rate expired in August of 2022, and then our system went out to a PBS application that houses appraisal rates, and it found what the applicable appraisal rate would be for this OA come September 2022. So the rent estimate information that's being delivered to your agency includes the amount based on the particular new appraised rate that's going to be hitting in September of 2022. So as you can see here, again, we're factoring in when the existing rates are going to be running through. We're seeing that they're expiring in a particular month, and then we're going out and grabbing that new replacement rate here. So the same concept can be applied on the leased side. Our system would go out, it would find when the occupancy agreement rates would be expiring, and it would go out and find a new lease rate in this same scenario. If the rates are not expiring, our system would simply carry this shell rate through to the end of the budget year. Moving on, we want to point out for operating cost. Operating cost is handled in a similar fashion. Now, if operating cost is not expiring within our budget window, we are still applying an annual escalation factor to your occupancy agreements that takes into account the escalation of operating. Obviously, we have inflation, and operating costs will still be escalated. The escalation factor that we use is provided to us by OMB. So on an annual basis, OMB will provide to us what percentage to apply in the estimate, and we use that factor when we apply our escalation. The operating rate can also increase by a new appraised rate. So as you can see here in the example at the top, the shell rate was replaced by a $17.11 new appraised shell rate. The same concept would apply to the operating. We would have a new operating rate based on that appraisal. And then lastly, we can, through our system, find new rates that would be new rates and amounts that would be available to us. So going back to the rent credits, if we know that there are going to be rent credits applied to this occupancy agreement at some future point within our rent estimate window, we're able to apply those and provide those back to you to give you an idea if certain occupancies or leases are going to be afforded any sort of rent credit. So next we want to move on to what the deliverable looks like, and I think this will help. It seemed like the more than half of the folks on the call right now. This is just a nice little screenshot of one part of the base rent estimate deliverable. So on an annual basis, we provide a deliverable, which for the base rent estimate, it's an Excel file that contains a breakout of all the occupancy agreements that billed in our window, which was March, so March 2020. This is going to give you a listing of all those occupancy agreements that billed March 2020, and it's going to give you the amounts based on the rent component that we have in our system for the current year +1 and the current year +2, which for this budget cycle was 2021 and fiscal 2022. So this file basically it gives you an idea of what your shell rent will be in 2022, what your operating cost will be, what your real estate tax amount. As you go further down in this deliverable, you'll see other components like what the parking amount will be, if there's any additional taxes that'll hit. It contains things like if there'll be credits associated with these occupancy agreements, and those will all be listed here. So the deliverable contains multiple tabs here. So you'll have one tab on basically how to use this file. There'll be a helpful queryable tool in the rent estimate and bill format. So that's really helpful. You can run a bunch of different filters based on either your bureau number, or you could even do it at the building level, and it'll kind of break out what your rent bill format will look like. It'll provide you that data in basically a top line summary. So instead of listing out all the rent components, you'll get one tab that has by OA, what the anticipated rent is for 2021 and 2022. And the last two tabs give you that really detailed information. Like it'll give you the shell rent, operating cost, real estate taxes, the things that I had just addressed. And now, since we've finished with the base rent estimate component, I'm going to hand it off to Shantoria to walk everyone through the IC part, the anticipated space change component.
Thanks, Michael. So anticipated space changes are needed to account for any future or known changes in space, since as Michael mentioned earlier, the base rent assumes that it's going to continue billing all the way through the end of the budget year. When you look in your anticipated space change file, you'll see 4 different types of inventory changes. The first being a new OAIC, and these are used for brand new occupancies or if you're replacing an existing occupancy. You will also see expansions or reductions, and these increase or decrease the rentable square feet at an existing occupancy. And lastly, we have terminations, which are used to end an existing occupancy. Inventory changes leverage monthly data that is generated by the base estimate, and it calculates the increase or decrease in rent associated with the space change. Any future rates that are captured in the base will also be reflected in your inventory changes. So where does the data that the inventory change comes from? Well, it depends on the type of the space change. For federally owned occupancies, we have PBS asset managers who coordinate with our revenue managers to create and manage the inventory changes. And they make changes directly into our rent estimate system. So this includes things like effective dates, change in square feet, ongoing adjustments, and everything of that nature. For leased occupancies, we have PBS realty specialists, which create projects in our inventory system, which we call Rexis, to capture any upcoming lease replacements, extensions, or terminations. The rent estimate system has a direct link to this data and will automatically create a space change record if there's a change in square feet. And for our system, it's a minimum of change of 10 square feet. And the effective date and the change in square feet are pulled from project details. There's one exception, which is the new OAICs. And regardless of the space type, inventory change records for a new space can be pulled from a draft or signed occupancy agreement. So now we want to take a look at what we see in our system for an inventory change. And starting on the left, you'll see this is a new OAIC for a GSA inventory change. And you can see I have highlighted in red boxes the effective date. So for this one, it is June 22nd, 2021. And we also see what the square footage for this new OAIC is going to be, which is about 1,500 square feet. And you can also see on the bottom there, we have boxes where we put in broker commission credits or free rent periods. So just like the base, we do take those types of credits into account. In the center, we list out all the different rates. So you'll see you have your shell rent, your operating costs, TI is listed there, as well as capital security. So if there's a rate in the data source for all these different components, they will be included in your inventory change. And then to the right, we have the monthly impacts. So the monthly impacts takes into the square footage, it takes into account the rates, but it'll also take into account the ongoing adjustments such as free rent. So we see that the free rent goes through November 2021. And you can see on the right that the monthly impacts don't start to kick in until December, which is the very next month. And then at the very bottom, we have their annual impacts. And that's the number that you will see on your anticipated space change file. So this is basically our system and what it looks like to us to develop these inventory changes. So now we want to see what you all will see in your file that is sent to you through the rent estimate. So this is, again, GSA's anticipated space change file. The very first thing we want to take or show to your attention is that the IC details, which are the columns, and these will be listed out by occupancy agreement. So you can see we have the impacts for all the different fiscal years. You can see that the type of change is listed out, the effective date, the square footage. There are also columns for things like parking and building number. So all that information will be listed out for you. Second, I wanted to mention the color coding because we have had questions on why are these rows color coded, and they're color coded based on the effective date. and what fiscal year the effective date falls in. So for this past rent estimate, red designates that it's effective starting in 2020, green is for 2021, and blue is 2022. Next year for the 2023 rent estimate, red would be 2021, green would be 2022, and blue will be 2023. So it does change based on what budget year we're looking at. And the last thing I wanted to point out for this file is that the inventory changes are split between owned and leased. And we do this because, particularly on the lease side, there are obviously some columns that would only pertain to lease, such as leased number. So to keep things relevant, we split them off and only have relevant columns for each. So those are the space changes. So we've gone through the base and we've gone through the space changes. So now we want to put everything together. And this is done on your Exhibit 54. So this is an example of one of GSA's bureaus. Each bureau has their own Exhibit 54. And we do send pre-populated Exhibit 54s to you through your rent estimate. And you can see at the very top, that's your base rent information. So you can see the square footage and the base rent estimate figures for each fiscal year. In the center, you have the inventory changes. And these are split off again by owned and leased. And at the very bottom, that's your annual number. So you have your annual square footage and you have your annual rent amount. And this is the basis for your budget request. Right, yeah, your budget request. So now we want to talk about our timeline for the rent estimate to give you some sort of idea of what our process is. So starting in mid-March, that's when our formulation begins. We use the March rent bill, and that's what's used to develop our base estimate. And around this time, we also start compiling inventory changes nationwide through our GSA offices. And then after we make our adjustments and final touches, we send it to OMB in early May. And between May and June, we go back and forth with OMB, answering their questions, making adjustments that they might request. And then in early summer, that's when we finally get approval for OMB. And that's when we send the estimate to customers. And we have to wait for OMB approval before we can send the estimate to customers. And as you all probably know, September is when your budget requests are due back to OMB. So with that said, we do have some polling questions on the timing of the rent estimate. So we can get the first one up there. And the question is, the rent estimate is provided too late in the budget process to benefit my agency.
And again, that's just a yes, no, or a NA, no basis to no choice for the answers. Again, just for the folks who can't see the polling. And thank you all so much. I'm getting a lot of stuff in my email about what people can see and what they can't see. And apparently there are some agencies that can't use even the link for Zoom. So thank you again for all your input as we move forward to try to figure out the best way to connect with everyone. And it looks like we are about, let's see, about 45% voted. Anybody else want to vote? Okay, there we go.
And these questions will help us because we pretty much think that folks are going to say that it is delivered too late. And this will really help us have conversations with OMB to see if we can deliver maybe draft data to folks on an earlier basis. So these poll questions will help us maybe even change some of our processes. So please answer those questions. Thank you.
All right, so it seems we got the results for the first one. We do have a second one that also deals with timing.
If you don't mind, Shantori, I'll just share with everyone again who can't see, we almost had a complete tie between the yeses and the nos, 25 and 26%, and half of the folks who voted said NA or no basis to no. So
Okay.
again, thank you. And then our final poll question. Here we go.
So when is the ideal time frame for your agency to receive the annual rent estimate?
And you all might be tempted to select the earliest option, but I think we want to phrase this as when is the ideal month that you can get the data, turn it around, and have it done by your deadline.
And the question for those who can't see is when is the ideal time frame for your agency to receive the annual rent estimate? And then we have 6 months listed: May, June, July, August, and September. I guess it's 5. And the last one is NA or no basis to no. And some folks are answering in the chat. Thank you very much. That's helpful too. Okay, we'll close the poll here. We got 48% voting. And there you go, Shantori, if you want to share the results with folks.
So it looks like there's a pretty, well, 38% said they had no basis to know, but other than that, there seems to be a pretty even split between May, June, and July. So that's very good to know, and we'll take that into account when we speak to OMB about our time frame. So thanks again for participating in that poll.
Yep, thank you.
All right, so next we want to go through frequently asked questions. So you can see the type of questions that we typically receive during the rent estimate. And the first question we typically receive is, why does the rent estimate show a future increase in rent while I am not changing space? And for the most part, this is due to a new appraisal or a new lease rate that's being applied due to the rate expiring, as we've went through earlier with the base. The second question, why does the rent estimate data not match my latest internal information? And this is because the rent estimate is really just a snapshot. It's based on March billing, and it's possible that more up-to-date information has been made available to you between the months of March and, say, July, when we send out the rent estimate. And that's what your Exhibit 54 is for. And that's where you can make updates, so your budget request will reflect your actual needs. The third question, why haven't I received my rent estimate yet? And as mentioned before, in our timeline, we have to wait for OMB to give approval. We can't send information before they give approval. And lastly, how can I get on the contact list for the official annual distribution? And we have a revenue division email address, and it's listed there in the slide for you. And if you email that address, we can add you to the distribution list. I would also mention that around May, we do send courtesy emails to everyone that is on that distribution list. And that is just a good opportunity to tell us if there are people that needs to be added or if there are people who need to be taken off. So that's all I have. So I'll send it back to Michael.
Thank you, Shantoria. So what we wanted to provide to you all was a list of resources. So if you have received a copy of that PDF that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, if you go to page 18 in that document, you'll see the various resources that we've listed here. There's links embedded in them so that once you click on the underlined section, you'll be pushed to the website, which you can grab more information. So just from the top, the PBS pricing policy, I think this is just helpful for you to have at your fingertips. Our rent estimate is based on, it tries to mirror the pricing policy as close as possible. So if you have questions about particular rates or information that's in your rent estimate, you will be able to tie some of the principles in that pricing policy to how we've formulated the estimate. The second component here is the rent library. This has a copy of the Exhibit 54 space budget justification. This is the file that's sent to OMB that basically contains your pretty much your backup for the amount of rent you're submitting as your request. It also contains a helpful PowerPoint presentation that kind of lays out what the Exhibit 54 is. It gives you some pointers on how to fill that form out. And there's some helpful videos in there as well, so I encourage you to take a look at that. The third item is just another link to Rent on the Web. This will bring you to the portal that allows you to access the rent bills. So this is really helpful for you to see current and past bills. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight for everybody the electronic occupancy agreement tool. This will bring you to the website that gives you access to the OA portal. So you'll be able to look at the individual occupancies for your agency. You can see things like when they're effective, when they expire, what version they're based on. There's a lot of helpful information at the OA level that's here. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening to the deck that we just went over. I hope you found it useful. We encourage you to please send any sort of pieces of feedback you have on the deck or anything like that. And with that, we're going to open it up to questions. So we've asked Jimbo to kind of go through the any sort of questions that are coming in and kind of pose those to us. If you have any questions right now, please feel free to enter those into the chat window and we can address those. So Jimbo,
Yep,
are there any questions we can address?
Lots of questions, but we've also got lots of time. Thank you all for being patient. We had decided before this presentation that we didn't want to try to break up a lot of the slides, interspersing the questions in between the slides. We knew we'd be able to get through this pretty quickly and answer a bunch of the questions with the frequently asked questions. So now we're at the questions portion, and I've been taking notes here. I'm going to go over a few that haven't already been answered by those FAQs. So one of the first questions from David, once the estimate is made by GSA, how soon are tenant agencies provided a copy of the estimate? I think we covered that in our timeline. Typically it goes out in July each summer, and that's once a year. But the second part of that question is, how soon are tenant agencies advised of increases in rent or changes in our OA rental rates?
How soon? So I think to answer that, I think I'm going to take a broad approach to answering that. So you are supposed to get a 2-year window of notification when those rates are going to increase. So the rent estimate is the mechanism that tells you that those rates are increasing. So I think it's important to note that when we formulate the rent estimate in the spring, we are capturing all the information that we have on hand through the budget window and then providing you that. So that includes those new lease rates, it includes new appraisal rates. And what PBS does is they run a process that before we formulate the estimate, they've completed those appraisals for those owned spaces, so that before our spring formulation for the budget window, we have all the appraisal data that we need to run on the owned side. And for those leases, we have lease projects that we know what's going to be going on in those leases. So the rent estimate that's provided to you in the summer is basically the best information that we have on hand that gives you an idea of where rent is going to be increasing, where it's going to be decreasing, and where space is going to be changing. I think that it's also important to note that the rent estimate is just that, it's an estimate. We find many examples where when we formulate information in the spring, and we find this, I think great examples are on the leased side. We will pull the anticipated future lease rate that is going to be applied in the budget year, but those rates can still change based on negotiations that are happening with your agency. So, we've found instances where we'll formulate in the spring and we'll grab data in the spring. And then right after we grab the data, there'll be a change to a lease rate. Whether it be a rate has changed because of ongoing negotiations, or maybe the tenant agency has said, oh, we don't need so much space. So those things will continue to change. Where possible, we do encourage our regional team, the people throughout the country, we do encourage them to continue submitting if there's any changes that are required to the estimate. So really, we're trying to keep the estimate as up to date as possible through OMB approval. But again, I would say that the estimate is a snapshot based on a particular time, and it's not going to be perfect in terms of capturing every change and every square footage change that might be occurring. And that's where the Exhibit 54 process comes into play. And this year, we've seen instances where customer agencies have reached out and said, hey, your estimate is a little off, or there's some information that we have that you don't, and we've worked together to make sure that we have provided back some updated figures based on the information that they're sharing with us. And I hope that answers that question. Jimbo or Shantoria, do you have any other thoughts on that?
So I actually just wanted to piggyback on that. There was another question from Chris Boldig in the House. What factors can cause the rent estimate to differ from actual billed monthly amounts? So you mentioned, Mike, timing differences between when the rent estimate is delivered and when a subsequent revised OA might be provided to you. But I wanted to point out, in my mind, the top two reasons why an estimate could be different than what ultimately bills 2 years down the road. And those are taxes and leased operating cost escalations. In federally owned properties, OMB sets the operating cost escalation factor, and that comes from the non-pay inflationary factor that the Council of Economic Advisors, if I get that bureau name correct, within the Executive Office of the President, sets those rates. Since we control the pricing policy in owned space, they provide that rate, and that's what we use to escalate operating costs in owned properties. Leases escalate using consumer price index for the local submarkets. We do not estimate each individual lease's individual CPI in the rent estimate. We apply the exact same 2% in most instances escalation factor to all space in the rent estimate. So ultimately, the CPI index that could hit a lease, if you have space in a lease, it could be lower than the 2% in the estimate, or it could be higher. So that's one common reason why the estimate will not match exactly, because that small operating cost escalation is almost never going to be exact in leased properties. But the other instance is taxes. The rent estimate should include an estimate of future tax increases. And as you can guess, taxes in individual markets can swing wildly, or some markets have significant increases over a 5 or 10 year period of your occupancy, and they're tough to estimate 2 years out. Until we get the bill, we don't know. So the rent estimate typically assumes that taxes will remain kind of flat, and then it applies that exact same OMB escalation factor to your taxes. Those are the two big things. Mike, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, or anything else that you'd add for what causes the difference in amounts.
I think, so those are great points, Jimbo. Thanks for that. Thanks for adding that. I think other things that we see frequently are project delays. So for example, if you know that your agency is projected to occupy a space March of 2022, that will be included in the rent estimate. But oftentimes many times what we find is that come 1 year later, when we look at that same project, maybe there's something that's delayed a little bit, and we see it's either been delayed a couple months, or we see that it's even been delayed into the following fiscal year. So project delays also can cause changes in what we provide you in the formulation and what you see end up actually billing. Okay, I think, is there anything else?
Okay.
Maybe,
Yep, we have
no,
another
that's
question. The OA numbers are not always listed for inventory changes, and it makes it difficult to match up our draft OAs on record or request a copy of the draft OA from GSA to verify for the Exhibit 54. Is there something that is being worked on to ensure OA numbers are always included?
Okay, so that's a great question. So I think the good news there and what I can share is that we used to have a much bigger problem with this. So let's take on the leased side, for example. We have scenarios where there'll be lease projects where 2 years out, we don't know the occupancy agreement number yet. But over time, what we began to see in our system is that there were draft occupancy agreements that were out there. It's just that our systems weren't properly connected to pull those in. We had a recent enhancement to our system that actually made that connection a little bit better. So we've improved on getting more OA numbers into our system, but it's still not 100% perfect. And I think that a driving factor of that is kind of what I just described in terms of lease projects, is that we'll have a lease project that's effective 2 years from now, but all we have at the time is a project number, and that project number might not even have what lease number is going to be associated with it. So for example, if your customer agency comes to us and says, we need leased space in Washington, D.C., we know that we need 10,000 square feet, and we know that the average rate per square foot in the DC area is $50 a square foot. So in our system, we'll have a leasing specialist set up a project that'll say the customer agency needs 10,000 square feet at $50 a square foot. And we'll be able to generate an estimate on that. But at that time, there might not be a draft occupancy agreement that's been set up. There might not even be, like I said, a lease number that's been set up as well. So all we have to go off of, which is what we'll provide to you, is, hey, we've got this need for you, 10,000 square feet at $50 a square foot, and we'll provide that estimated number to you and the record to you so that you can review it and take a look at it. But we're always looking at ways in our system that we can grab more information for you. So I can definitely say that we're getting better at it, but still there's areas for improvement, and I can empathize with that question. Thank you for that. Jimbo, Shantoria, do you guys have any additional pieces for that?
We had two questions relating to OMB. The first is whether OMB or GSA sends out the rent estimate to agencies. And I'll just answer that one. GSA sends out the rent estimate after OMB approves. And the second question was, what are the review procedures performed by the OMB examiners on the rent estimate? Okay,
great question. So what I can say, so what we provide to OMB is different from what we provide to the customer agencies. So when we send our deliverable to all of you, you guys get very detailed, down to the occupancy agreement pieces of information. What we provide to OMB is a set of exhibits that provides them a level of detail, but it doesn't get that far into the weeds at the OA level. What OMB will get is, what is the projected estimate for the current fiscal year, the next fiscal year, and then the budget year. So they'll get that at the agency level. So the first piece of information they see is how much the agency's rent is projected to increase, and they can look at it from 20. Let's use this year as an example. They can see what is the agency's rent going to increase from 2020 to 2021, and we'll provide them what the increase from 2021 to 2022 is. So they see that first top line number at the agency level. The next piece is breaking that down to the bureau level. So they'll get a bureau level breakout of the increases that are going to be happening at your region. The next component that we share with them is we look at the specific changes that are happening at the bureau level, and we identify if there's any changes that are occurring that's at a high level. So our filter is anything that's increasing by, at the bureau level, 10% or more, or I think it's over $100,000. So when there are big changes, we try to identify for OMB the specific projects that are driving those big changes. And once we get that list at the bureau level, then we start looking into the specific projects and the specific changes that are going on to provide to OMB. So for example, one of our exhibits is like 70 to 80 records of specific projects that are impacting the agency. And one, I think, great example is that we've provided for the past couple of years is obviously, this is in the news, the census, right? The Census Bureau is undergoing the decennial census currently. So the past several years, the Bureau of the Census was having a big rent increase because they needed to occupy, so many offices throughout the country to conduct the census. So that was a big effort to provide them the specific changes and what is happening at the census. So once OMB gathers that information and how they digest it is, there are specific projects and issues that are going on that they discuss with other examiners, and that they will come back to us and say, I saw that you identified, let's say 9 of the 10 things that we have on our plate at OMB. You've identified those that help us to see that it's included in the rent estimate. But hey, I spoke to this examiner at a different agency, and they're telling me about a specific project that's occurring. I don't see that in the rent estimate. So can you please give us more information on that specific project? And I think just lastly, the specific projects are typically prospectus level projects. They're large things that are going on at the agency. And those are the types of pieces of information that they're looking at. And an example that I just thought of was coronavirus this year. We went through a process with them of looking at what we estimate after the CARES Act, what we estimate cleaning to be in space come 2022. So that was a big effort to work with them to make sure that we included those amounts into the rent estimate correctly. So I think that gives everybody a pretty decent high-level look. Jimbo, Shantori, do you guys have any other thoughts? Anything I didn't touch on in relation to how we work with OMB?
I think that covers it. There's one other somewhat related question from Casey. If an agency enters into an additional occupancy agreement in July, is this factored into Exhibit 54 prior to distribution to the agency? July is a little late. Typically, once the data goes over to OMB, the only updates we would be pushing to OMB would be very large, significant errors or misses or omissions. That being said, OMB also has a lot of prospectus level projects that they're interested in that they'll ask questions about that we may circle back to and make adjustments to. But if a new occupancy is being negotiated in July that was missed in the original estimate, most likely not. That would be something that you'd want to double check and add into your Exhibit 54 submission before you submit that. It would not be in the pre-populated version that we send you. Did you want to say something, Mike?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. And we've seen these, this year we usually have these scenarios. And just like Jimbo said, the Exhibit 54 process is where that can be handled. And we've had examples this year where folks have come and said, hey, your rent estimate doesn't include this. Can you help me to factor in, we have a new occupancy that, we just see came in. We'd like to factor that into our budget request. And there's a team of folks that will also share the contact information for them. But if you reach out to us before you've submitted your budget, there's that process where we can help you through the Exhibit 54 to make sure that those changes get into your budget request.
Okay, so you also brought up COVID, so we had a couple questions related to that. The first from Alexis, are the increased operating costs based on enhanced cleaning for COVID incorporated in federal occupancy rent estimates for FY22 when customers are responsible for that cost component? And what about leased occupancies?
So I believe I think I just want to confirm that last part. That last part is if the space is delegated to your agency, right? So if your agency has delegated authority on that occupancy agreement, we GSA did not include. We made the best effort to not include those COVID cleaning costs to those occupancy agreements. So what we did was we looked where there were operating rates being applied, and we said, okay, if the occupancy agreement is billing an operating rate, that means it's not a delegated occupancy agreement, meaning that GSA maintains and manages the operations. So in those instances, we included an estimated value for what we think the COVID cleaning will be. But for delegated spaces, we made the best effort to not include that cost.
And
Jimbo, is that
that is, yep, that's great. It's a no, we did not include the costs in the rent estimate for delegated space where the tenant has the authority to operate the building. And the second part of that question was leased occupancies. Yes, the cleaning costs are included for leased occupancies. We expect, or we're already issuing unilateral lease amendments to require our lessors to provide those services, and we will be paying them for providing those services. That's all being covered by the CARES Act now. In 22, it will be built into the rent component of the rent bill. It's all estimates as of right now. It could change, and of course, for political reasons, it could get pulled out of our budgets, yours and ours, at some point in the future as well. So we're all kind of still on standby, waiting to hear more. Once these budgets all go up to the OMB and the Hill, I imagine they could change. It's, to quote you the number, it's about $260 million of additional rent costs specific to cleaning and HVAC services related to COVID. We had a second that I think maybe we already addressed. How are the increased costs for COVID cleaning being estimated, and in what year will they be in place? Is there anything you want to add for that, Mac?
Yeah, so so as we were told, basically that the CARES Act would cover those costs through 2021. So our latest rent estimate provides no adjustments for COVID for 2021. For 2022, it includes an enhanced cleaning cost, and that was applied to the operating cost for the occupancy agreements.
Okay. I also want to make sure I'm addressing, to the extent we can, we have two questions related to appraisals, which isn't quite our bread and butter, but I think we have Abe from our valuations division on the line. If he's not able to answer these questions now, I'm at least going to put them out here and we can follow up later. The first is from Matthew: what are the key factors for the appraisal which cost more than the OA? Which, if I'm reading that correctly, I think you asked this question when we were showing the example of the occupancy that was expiring, resetting the market, and pulling in a new appraisal. So what is it that causes an appraisal to come in at a higher rate than the old rate? And then similar related question, are rent square footage comparables taken from private sector rents, other government-owned properties, or a blend?
Yes, this is Abe. Can you guys hear me?
Yep. We got you.
Okay, great. Yes, I appreciate those questions. As far as the rate changes, it's basically, as it was stated here, in anticipation of expiration of OAs and needing a new rate for the renewal of the OAs, the regional appraisers, they appraise those buildings like about 2 years plus in advance. So that way we have the budget ready for Michael and his team. So in those instances, we don't basically, we go to the market, and whatever the appraisal, the way they are, basically they rely on the market. As it was stated, these are commercially equivalent rates. So the appraisers, they go, perhaps this answers both questions. They go to the market and then they find private sector comparables. That means buildings are the most similar to the property they're appraising, the federal property they're appraising. And our preference is, so we would not be competing with ourselves. Our preference is they'd be looking for private sector leases. That means not involving federal government. So this is our preference. Sometimes the location is somewhat desolate and is not that much activity going on. They might we might give them green light to use some federal related transaction as far as that. But generally, we go private sector. We prefer that again, so we won't be competing with ourselves. And as far as the other one, we do not look at, when we do the appraisal, we don't look at the rate, what was the rate before, because this is what the market is. Whatever market bears, whatever the market changes was, it could be higher, it could be lower. So we rely on whatever the outcome of the appraisal is, and we have that in our system where the rent team pick up the rate from that. I hope I've answered both questions.
Yeah, I also thank you, Abe, for that. I also just wanted to add from my experience with working with Abe, and we do get questions from customers. They'll say, why did my rate increase so much? And when we look at those, sometimes a lot of situations that I'll find is when we look at the markets and we look at the appraisal that the rate is based on, we'll look in that surrounding area and you'll find like major renovations or major new buildings that have popped up. In Washington, D.C., a very good example is along the waterfront over by the Jefferson Memorial. They renovated that waterfront area with brand new hotels and piers and really revitalized that area. So that, in turn, had increased the appraisals in some of those buildings that we were looking at. So I think a lot of times when we go and, when our rent estimate team kind of does some digging with the appraisal team, there's renovations in these areas that are pushing rates a little higher.
Okay. There was a question about tax escalations, and Katrina will address your specific occupancy and situation after this session, but I had mentioned tax escalations as a common reason for the estimate varying from what your actual bill ends up billing 2 years down the road. I want to just elaborate on that a little bit more because we do get a lot of questions relating to tax escalations. What is that? For space you occupy in private sector owned space, the government will pay the lessor the tax bill for that property. It's going to be billed pro rata across the customers in the building. So if you only occupy 50% of the building, you'll only be past 50% of the tax bill. There can be state taxes, central business district taxes. I've even seen separate taxes from like a local college campus that was in the area. Somehow a tax bill got passed along from whatever local taxes there are. In your rent bill, sometimes you'd pay no taxes throughout the year. We get the tax bill at the end of the year, and then you are past your full annual portion of that bill, or more commonly in 6-month segments. So twice a year, you'll get 6 months worth of taxes hitting your OA through the rent bill. So you'll see a spike in that 1 month of your rent billing. More commonly, and we try to make this more common, we build in an estimate of taxes into your monthly rent so that you are paying an estimated amount of your annual taxes throughout the year. When the bill comes from the lessor, we calculate the difference between what you've paid and what you owe, and then you only get the difference, whether it be a credit or a debit, passed in the rent bill. So that's the tax escalation piece. whether it's the whole bill or just the portion of the difference between what you've already paid and what the final bill came in at. That's what we mean when we say the tax escalation. So again, sometimes it's a credit to you if you've overpaid throughout the year. And when you're looking at just that tax escalation piece, that's the reason why it can swing so much some years, because some years we hit it right on the nose with the estimate, but other years, maybe the taxes for your local area are continuing to climb and climb and climb, and what's in the OA to bill monthly on a monthly basis is not increasing. So that tax escalation piece is going to grow each year. So I just wanted to address that. There's probably still some questions regarding tax escalations that we can follow up on later afterwards. And again, Katrina will answer your specific question afterwards. Where is that tax escalation spreadsheet in your set? So the tax escalation is calculated by PBS Office of Leasing. When they receive the tax bills from the lessor, they do a process to get the supporting documentation to ensure the bill is full and accurate, and they do the pro rata apportionment and put those tax bill escalations into the occupancy agreement to generate that billing adjustment in the rent bill. Hopefully that answers your question. If you ever have a question about your taxes, we can probably help pull the documentation that PBS received that was used to calculate that tax bill for you.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, Shantori, if there's any other important questions I've missed, please jump in and share those. I'm also just reading from the bottom up. I probably missed a couple, but we've got a few more minutes here. So another question was, when do the enhanced COVID costs become pass-through?
When do they? Not sure if I'm understanding that correctly.
I think they're already a pass-through. What's in the rent estimate now is an estimate of what we expect them to be. They will change. I assume lease by lease. The unilateral lease amendment that went out to all lessors requiring them to provide this extra service had a proposed rate, and each lessor has the opportunity to come back and request more funds if they can justify it. And that's the process where I think will be ongoing for another while, negotiating with each individual lessor to get those services at a ideal rate.
Okay, guys, have we sort of exhausted all the questions that are answerable at this time?
I think perhaps we have.
And again, if anybody, if there's any specific questions, we'll follow up with you on that and get back to you.
All right.
And sorry, just while we're still closing out this one item, Laura asks, does the most recent Exhibit 54 that shows FY22 have the COVID cleaning cost estimate in there? Yes, yes it does. And if you are on the rent estimate distribution list and you receive the email from us with that data, the body of the email actually specifies the dollar amount for your agency that was added to cover the COVID cleaning costs. And we put that in there primarily because we think down the road, OMB might be asking us or customers to adjust the amount estimated for that portion. So it'll be helpful for you to know how much of your rent estimate was made up of that COVID cleaning cost.
Oh, and Christy asked again how we get on the rent distribution list. Can you run through that email address one more time? Oh, thank you, Jimbo. All right.
Yeah, so I think we'll work with Rebecca to see how, we'll work with Rebecca to make sure that some of these main things get sent out, but on page 17 of our deck, the email address is listed here. If you'd like to get on our distribution list, please email that and just request your name to be added. What we often find from folks is folks will email and say, you know, hey, this person retired or that person moved to a different division. Can you please make these adjustments to the distribution list. And if you have, obviously, you know, of course, if you have any questions about who is on the distribution list for your agency, feel free to send those questions over, and we can help share that list with you.
Terrific. Well, thank you guys so much. I'd really like to extend my thanks to Jimbo, Michael, and Shantoria, and Abe. Thank you, Abe, for an extremely informative presentation today. I'd also like to thank all of you, our customers, for being able to join us today. We hope that you found this to be a very beneficial presentation, and we will be sharing it on our www.gsa.gov/CES website when the recording is all set. We'll also be providing there formal written responses to all the questions that you put in the chat today. Thank you for those. And now for a quick plug for our next show. You can register for the next Client Enrichment Series, which is going to be on November 10th. The RWA, that's the Reimbursable Work Authorization National Program Manual Highlights. You can learn more about that and register for any upcoming sessions that we have scheduled online, again at www.gsa.gov/CES. And you'll be added to our mailing list, so you'll be invited to our future sessions. The goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective program management of your real estate and your workplace programs. Thanks again, everyone. Have a terrific fall.